Welcome to day 27 of Purpose-Driven Church for Unificationists. We are currently looking at the 10 ways in which churches can become purpose-driven. And we're going to finish them up. We're going to start at number 4, go through number 10. So number 4 is to start small groups on purpose. So he goes over the different kinds of small groups that they have, and it's really quite extensive. They've got seeker groups, they've got support groups, they've got service groups, they've got growth groups, and all these groups specialize in one of the different purposes of the church. He says many of our support, for example, with the support groups, many of our support groups are related to providing support and fellowship during a specific stage of life, such as new parents, college students, or empty nesters. Others deal with healing specific hurts encountered by those who have lost a mate by death or divorce. We also have a full menu of recovery groups. Pretty amazing. Anyway, they've got a whole bunch of different groups, but they're all geared around the purpose of the church. He says that rather than force everyone to conform to a one-size-fits-all mentality, we allow people to choose the type of small group that best fits their needs, their interests, their stage of life, or their spiritual maturity. We do not expect each small group to fulfill every purpose of the church, but we do require that each one must be organized around at least one purpose of the church. Then they talk about adding staff. So when they are looking to hire staff or looking for people to fulfill a certain job, he says that they look for people who are really passionate about one of the purposes of the church. As long as they're passionate, even if they don't necessarily have other necessary skills, then they are people who are self-motivated, and that's very important. He goes on to say something which is kind of interesting to me. He says, if I was to start a new church today, I would begin by recruiting 5 volunteers for 5 unpaid staff positions: a musician, magnification director to help prepare the worship service for the crowd, a membership director to teach class 101 and oversee the care of members in the congregation, a maturity director to teach class 201 and oversee the Bible study programs for the committed, a ministry director to teach class 301, interview people for ministry placement, and interview and supervise the lay ministries of the core, and a mission director to teach class 401 and oversee our evangelism and missions program in the community. So it's really interesting. He's saying that with all his experience and success with Saddleback, if he was to start a new church today with nothing, he would start off by having these 5 people in place, which is kind of interesting because it's all geared around people and raising people through different levels of maturity, and that's what he would focus on more than anything else. And I get that, because without mature members, your accomplishment is all based off of what you yourself can do with maybe a bunch of people who maybe are not completely solid in their faith and are not necessarily interested in giving back. And that's kind of a recipe for stagnation and burnout, I would think. And then he says eventually, as the church grew and developed, he would move those people to part-time paid staff and then eventually become full-time. And that way you can grow regardless of the size of your church and your finances. Next thing is structuring on purpose. I'm not going to talk about this so much, but basically they have a very clear structure in their church about how everything gets done and everything gets covered, and it's all organized by teams and those specific projects, and those teams have very specific responsibilities. They know exactly what they're doing, and they oversee a certain purpose that their team is related to. For example, missions team, a music team, membership team, maturity team, ministry team. These are teams geared around the 5 different purposes and the development levels. And then preaching on purpose. He says to produce balanced, healthy believers, you need to plan a preaching schedule that includes a series on each of the 5 purposes over the course of a year. So he's just saying that if you don't focus on these 5 purposes purposefully, then eventually you'll just focus on certain ones that are more around your personal passion, and then you'll kind of become out of balance. So he says planning and preaching around the 5 purposes of the church does not mean you must always be teaching about the church itself. But when you use the 5 purposes of the church as a guide for planning your preaching schedule, you are preaching with a purpose. Then he talks about budgeting. He talks about with their budgeting, they're on their church budget, every line is a purpose. So instead of like maybe kind of like what we do, when we put our finance statement, every line is like maintenance or outreach activity or salary or something like that. They create their budget and they create their finance statements based on what purpose are they fulfilling with that activity or with that expenditure. He says that the quickest way to discover a church's priorities is to look at its budget and calendar. The way we spend our time and the way we spend our money shows what is really important to us, regardless of what we claim to believe. For example, if your church claims that evangelism is a priority, you need to be able to back up that claim with dollars allocated in your budget. Otherwise, you're just blowing smoke, which I think is absolutely true. Then calendar on purpose. Make sure that you schedule things around your purposes. He mentions like taking certain months of the year and designated them to emphasize certain purposes, like a mission month, a membership month, a magnification month. He says that if you don't schedule on purpose, to emphasize your purposes, they won't get emphasized. And then finally, number 10 is to evaluate on purpose. He says to remain effective as a church in an ever-changing world, you need to continually evaluate what you do. Build, review, and revision into your process. At Saddleback, we've developed a tracking tool we call the Saddleback Snapshot. So every month, they create this snapshot and they look at what's our attendance in certain areas, how are people doing, and they look at it every month to review how they're doing, how they're fulfilling their purpose. And it really makes it easy for them to be able to identify bottlenecks. So like, for example, if worship attendance is up 35%, they say, but small group attendance is only up 20%, then there's some gap in the system there that needs to be rectified and looked at. The point is that when you have a purpose, a clear purpose, you always have to be looking at, are we fulfilling that purpose? We must be constantly asking, what is our business and how's business? With a for-profit business, it's very relatively easy to identify to a certain degree how we're doing, because oftentimes results are seen in terms of money. But with a church, it's not always easy to identify that just using that simple metric. There's lots of other factors that need to be put into consideration. And lastly, he finishes the chapter with this section called Growing Stronger. And I'm just going to read it because I feel like this is what we want to see happen in our communities, and I really like it. It's kind of like the overall end goal, or something that when I read it, I just felt like wow, I'd love to see this happen. So he says, as you seek to apply your purposes in every area of your church, you will notice the church growing stronger and stronger. Instead of constantly looking for new programs each year to keep people excited and motivated, you will be able to focus on the essentials. You will be able to learn from each mistake and build on every success. If unchanging purposes guide your church, you will be able to work on fulfilling those purposes better each passing year. Momentum works in your favor. The more your members understand and commit to your purpose, the stronger your church will become. So I thought that was pretty cool. I think you will agree. So tomorrow we'll look at part 3. Thanks a lot.